Hey there, welcome back to another recording session for the Based on a True Story podcast. Now, if you've watched any of the other recording sessions, you'll have an idea of how this goes. But if this is your first time, welcome. Basically, we're going to be recording an audio podcast here, and we're going to be recording it for, my podcast is called Based on a True Story. Basically, we compare history with movies. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the movie Rob Roy. And we're going to learn some of the history behind the real Rob Roy and then kind of compare it with what we saw in the movie. So there's a couple things to keep in mind. So this is the recording session. This is not the final episode. The final episode will show up on the podcast. I usually like to post them up on YouTube as well. So that is forthcoming. I usually record a few months ahead of time. And so this episode will not be coming for a few months as of this particular recording. Now, so there's that. I'm not really going to be paying attention to the video. That's another thing to keep in mind. So I'm really going to be looking at my computer, which is right here. It has my script, and then it has the audio program Mixcraft that I record into that you can see right here. So you'll be able to see that as well. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that you need to know if this is your first time. Not really. So this particular episode here, this one is going to be a little bit different than our usual episodes. And the reason for that is because I actually have a special guest on this episode. It's Moxie from Your Brain on Facts. Now, her podcast is fantastic. It's a bunch of, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's Your Brain on Facts. So it's a bunch of facts, right? Great stuff. Go check out her podcast. And she was kind enough to come on this show, but of course, it's not going to be a traditional interview, but instead we're going to do it a little bit different. I say different. I've actually I did this actually with Cody Wheat from Shots of History, which another great podcast. And basically, the way we're going to do this is she recorded parts of the episode, and I recorded parts of the episode. Well, I'm going to record parts of the episode, and then we'll edit them together to sound like it all flows together nicely. So I'm just going to be recording my parts in this particular recording session, and so it's going to sound like I'm kind of bouncing around, and that's because I'm not recording Moxie's parts, of course. So let's get started. The first thing we need to record is actually a little bit of a parental warning, which I like to put on episodes when we talk about things that are, well, kids really shouldn't be watching or listening to, generally speaking. So this one in particular, if you've seen Rob Roy, you'll know that there's some violent stuff in there and some really, and one scene in particular, it's absolutely horrible. So we're going to have this little parental warning. So let's record this. Real quick, before we begin, the movie we're covering today has some violent themes in it that we'll be talking about. So if you're listening with kids, you might want to check this one out on your own first. Short, sweet, and to the point. I try to do that. Oops, don't want to do that. I want to save. I try to do that. Best be safe than sorry. Last thing I want is for parents to be listening with kids and be shocked or something. So try to do that whenever possible. Even though, we're not swearing or anything like that. Try to keep this pretty family friendly. There were a lot of great movies that came out in the mid-90s, and Liam Neeson was in quite a few of them. In fact, he was in 17 movies in the 1990s, including Star Wars Episode 1, Les Mis, and one of the most popular World War II movies of all time, and another movie that we've looked at on this podcast, Schindler's List. Today, we're going to be learning about the true story behind another of Liam Neeson's masterpiece movies from the 1990s. Joined by an all-star cast in Jessica Lange, John Hurt, and Tim Roth, 1995's Rob Roy tells the story of a man who has been referred to as Scotland's Robin Hood. But I won't be telling today's story alone. I'm excited to be joined by Moxie LaBouche from the fantastic podcast called Your Brain on Facts as we dive into the true story behind the 1995 film Rob Roy. I'm Dan Lefebvre, and this is based on a true story. All right, so in there, I say I'm Dan Lefebvre, and then Moxie recorded a part where she says her name. So I'm going to, and this, yep, right there. So there we go. So that's a reminder for me in editing. Save this, and all right. So let's continue on. Before starting our story today, let's set up our game, Two Truths and a Lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to say three things. Two of them are true, which means one of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Tim Roth's character in the movie was fictional. Number two, Rob Roy's legend began to grow before he died. Number three, Rob Roy had an ongoing feud with the Duke of Argyll for years. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, you'll find the two facts scattered somewhere throughout the episode, and by a simple process of elimination, you'll know which one is a lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. Oh, and don't forget to check out Moxie's show called Your Brain on Facts. It's all about... Actually, Moxie, why don't you give us a quick overview about what your show... That was about what your show was about? No. Oh, and don't forget to check out Moxie's show called Your Brain on Facts. It's all... Actually, Moxie, why don't you just give us a quick overview of what your show is about? Insert Moxie. She recorded this. And now... Thanks, Moxie. And you can subscribe to her show over at Based on... Okay, I get used to subscribe at Based on a True Story. Nope, it's a different show. Thanks, Moxie. And you can subscribe to her show over at yourbrainonfacts. I'm still saying Based on a True Story. Okay. Thanks, Moxie. And you can subscribe to her show over at yourbrainonfacts.com. Once again, that's yourbrainonfacts.com. And now let's learn more about the story we saw in the movie Rob Roy. Okay, now that's the so parental advisory, intro, and then two truths and a lie, and give myself another break for the meat of the episode. So let's come in. All right, so here we go. After a couple minutes of credits to open the movie, we see some text on screen that sets up the scene for us. According to the movie, at the beginning of the 1700s, Scotland was ravaged by famine, disease, and greed. People were emigrating to the Americas, causing Scotland's clan system to die off. Then we're given a date, 1713. It is true that there were immigrants from Scotland coming to what we now know as America, even before the United States was a country. As is often the case when someone decides to pack up and leave their home, there were many factors that went into the people crossing the Atlantic Ocean to find a new home. It started about 100 years before the timeline in the movie, when thousands of Scottish fled their homelands and made their way to Ireland to escape all manner of calamities. Religious conflicts, drought, battles with the English, and so on. Things weren't too much better there. Then, in 1707, when the Act of Union was signed, merging together Scotland and England into the United Kingdom, in the minds of some, things got even worse. So that's why, just like the movie says, Scottish and Irish started making their way to the Americas. Although it's worth pointing out that, as far as we know, there wasn't ever any indication that Rob Roy or any of his men wanted to emigrate to the Americas. In other words, the movie didn't really have any reason to mention the immigrations to the U.S. at all, except, as some reviewers of the movie indicated, to try to tie the movie to filmgoers in the U.S. in some way. After this bit of setting to open the movie, we see a beautiful green mountainside. Then, off in the distance, we can see men approaching. There's 6 of them. And as one of them gets close to the camera, he reaches down and picks at something in the ground. He picks it up a bit and sniffs it and then puts it in his mouth, chews it and spits it out. Gross. I don't think that was grass. It is true that trackers use animal droppings as means It is true that trackers use animal droppings as one means of tracking animals, but I wouldn't recommend putting it in your mouth, though. Finally, we're introduced to Liam Neeson's character, Rob Roy, when we see they're tracking thieves who stole some cattle. They catch up to the thieves, and then the next day, Rob kills their leader. The rest of the thieves can leave, and Rob returns home to his wife, Mary, and their 2 boys. Mary's played by Jessica Lange. All right, and so that's a break for Moxie. She kind of goes in and explains that that's all made up, that whole intro scene and stuff. But there's a few facts in there. You know, Rob Roy was real, of course. He had a wife. He had a couple kids at that point in the timeline. And we are picking back up a little bit later on, so I'm going to give myself a little bit of space there for editing. And let's continue recording. Or at least that's one version of the story. As is often the case with history, there's a lot we don't know for sure. What we do know, though, is that the real Rob Roy was married to a woman named Mary Helen. Some historians refer to her as Mary, while others refer to her as Helen. On her grave, which you can find photos of online, it lies right next to Rob and 2 of their children. She actually has it listed as Helen. But because the movie calls her Mary, for the sake of simplicity, that's what I'm going to call her throughout this episode as well. She was born in 1671, the same year as Rob, and she was actually Rob's cousin. The 2 were married in January of 1693. The movie's timeline starts in 1713, and we can see that 2 young boys when Rob returns home. In truth, Rob and Mary had 3 children by 1713 rolled around. They were all boys. James was born in 1695, Colin in 1698, and Ranald McGregor was born in 1706. Going back to the movie, we're soon introduced to more characters pivotal to the plot. First, there's John Campbell, the Duke of Argyll. He's played by Andrew Keir in the film. Then there's the Marquess of Montrose. He's played by John Hurt. And according to the movie, we see Montrose and Argyll bet on the outcome of a duel between Gilbert Martin's character, Guthrie, and Tim Roth's character, Archie Cunningham. And go hand back off to Moxie. Add her in there. And she recorded this part here. Boom. Oh, one thing, minor thing. You notice I mentioned the Marquess of Montrose. Interestingly, I've always pronounced it Marquis, but in the movie they pronounce it Marquess. But also, something interesting, I actually looked it up, and everywhere that I saw, the historians that were talking about it all pronounced it Marquess. So that's how I pronounced it. All right, that's how it's pronounced, according to many historians. All right, so here's the next part for me. As we learned, Archie Cunningham is a fictional character, although the character of Killearn was a real person. His full name was John Graham of Killearn, but for the sake of simplicity, let's follow the movie's lead and call him Killearn. It is true that Rob found himself between Argyll and Montrose and strapped in debt. and some say it was to the tune of about £1,000 in today's money. You might say that Argyle and Montrose were rivals, and basically Rob's lands happened to be right between the two. For much of his earlier adult years, Rob lived in relative peace as a cattle dealer. Basically, each year, the Duke of Montrose would give Rob £1,000, and then he would use that to buy cattle, raise the cattle, and then sell them back at a higher price, paying back the investment and making some money for himself in the process. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was some extra interest in there from Montrose as well. But then the next year would roll around, and then the same thing would happen, and that was basically how he lived. That went on for about a decade between 1702 or 1703 and then 1712. Things were going well. Now, there's some conflicting reports on exactly what happened, but as the story goes, in 1712, the cattle market tanked. In June of 1712, he was denounced for defaulting on his loans. We don't really know if it was Rob himself who took the money or if it was one of his men, but Rob was held accountable for the £1,000 loan that disappeared. Some reports suggest that it was Rob's head cattle drover who was supposed to deliver money to Rob from the Duke of Montrose, but instead absconded with the money himself. Still, other versions of the story suggest that maybe Rob took off with some of Montrose's cattle, too. In either case, Montrose really wasn't too happy and set about trying to destroy Rob by mounting a campaign of police action against him. It probably didn't help that Rob was able to stay hidden thanks to help from John Campbell, the second Duke of Argyll and Montrose's arch rival. He was sympathetic to Rob, Argyll was sympathetic to Rob as a fellow Jacobite supporter. Back in the movie, we see Archie and Killearn show up at Rob's house with a detachment of soldiers. Rob isn't there, he's already gone into hiding, but under Archie's leadership, the soldiers kill cattle and burn the house, but not before Archie brutally rapes Mary. That didn't happen. At least, not the way the movie says. All right. Man, I got all that without a mistake. Woohoo. All right, so Moxie comes in here. And then what I'm going to do here is come in and scroll down. All right, we're ready for our next part. Back in the movie, we see the results of the plot line between the fictional Archie and Rob. The tension escalates when Rob's brother, Alasdair, is killed by Archie's men. Just before dying, he tells Rob about how Mary was raped by Archie, causing Rob's blood to boil. That didn't happen. We already learned about Archie and Mary's rape, but the real Rob Roy... We already learned about Archie and Mary's rape, but the real Rob Roy McGregor never had a brother named Alasdair like the movie shows. His siblings were John, Sarah, Margaret, and a half-brother named John, also John, another one, and Duncan. In the movie, we see Liam Neeson's version of Rob leave Mary to go deal with Archie. When he does, he tells Mary that if their baby is a boy, name it after him. If it's a girl, name it after her. And according to the movie, it turns out to be a boy, so they name him Robert. The name is true. Although, as we learned earlier in the timeline, the circumstances surrounding his birth that we see in the movie is way off. Robert McGregor was Rob and Mary's last child when he was born in 1716. As the movie comes to an end, we see a duel between Rob Roy and Archie Cunningham. The duel is sponsored by the arch rivals, Argyll and Montrose. After being beaten by Archie, Rob is about to be killed when he grabs Archie's blade with his bare hand, catching Archie off guard. Rob jumps up, fatally cutting Archie. A shocked Archie stumbles and drops to the ground, dead. Then, after settling his affairs with Argyll and Montrose, Rob heads home to Mary, and in true Hollywood fashion, the two live happily ever after. At this point, you can probably guess how accurate that is. Since there's no way Rob could have had a duel with a fictional character like Archie Cunningham, that begs the question, how does Rob Roy McGregor's story end? Well, it wasn't quite the Hollywood ending like the movie. It also wasn't wrapped up into a single duel like the movie. All right, Moxie comes in. That's her part. And you know, what? I think I messed up. You know what I did? Let me look. All right, I think I messed up, and I will explain it once I figure out if I actually did or not. That's part of the show. All right. Boom. After her, the child. Yes. All right. So here we go. Not really. Not a big mess up. All right. So you can see I'm right here. So I'm actually, this is where I record everything, write everything. So, all right. So you can see here, I have the highlighted. This is the blue parts are Moxie's, and then this here. So what I had done, and this is the part off this, well, it's not off the screen if I drag it over here. So before I had this part as something that Moxie was recording, but it's really talking about an episode that I have based on a true story. And so I thought, okay, I'll just record that since I'm talking. Moxie wasn't on those episodes. So I actually changed that, and she did not record those parts. So I'm going to move this over here. And if you want this transcript, by the way, I post the transcripts when the episode posts. So it's on basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Every single episode has its own post, and then the transcript is part of that. So if you want this, that's available up there. Yeah, so I need to record this part here. If that name rings a bell, it's probably because you've heard of Mary Stuart, or as she's more commonly known, Mary, Queen of Scots. You can learn more about her story in the episodes where we learned about the movie Elizabeth and Elizabeth, the Golden Age. Brief little part there. All right, so now down to the next part, and I think the rest of this is pretty much the same as what I had before. It's just, I had that. All right. By the time 1717 rolled around, the Jacobite uprising was suppressed. In July of that year, the Indemnity Act of 1770 was passed by the Parliament in Great Britain. As a part of this act, many of the Jacobite rebels were pardoned for their participation. However, the MacGregor clan, including Rob Roy, was specifically excluded from this act. He was still an outlaw. In the spring of 1719, there was a royal proclamation calling for Rob's capture. Seemingly unfazed by this, Rob led troops as part of yet another Jacobite uprising. Like the rebels before, it failed. Then, in 1722, he was finally captured and imprisoned for his crimes. Meanwhile, English author Daniel Defoe had found success writing what many today consider to be the first ever English novel. I'm speaking, of course, about Robinson Crusoe, which was published for the first time on April 25th, 1719. And then Moxie has this fun little side note that she records there. And then I continue on. Almost like what we did with the little Elizabeth episode. I have a little paragraph and then there, so it's shorter. That's important to our story today because it was in 1723 that a fictional account of Rob Roy's life was published. That book was entitled The Highland Rogue, or The Memorable Actions of the Celebrated Robert. All right, let me just do that whole part over. That's important to our story today because it was in 1723 that a fictional account of Rob Roy's life was published. That book was entitled The Highland Rogue, or The Memorable Actions of the Celebrated Robert MacGregor, commonly called Rob Roy. And it's a book commonly attributed to Daniel Defoe. When he wrote his own novel simply called Rob Roy that bolstered the story, author Sir Walter Scott said he thought Defoe should have written it, but he never really was confirmed as the author. Daniel Defoe, that is, was never confirmed as the author of The Highland Rogue. In more recent years, some have rejected the idea that Defoe wrote the 1723 book, and rather, the author is left anonymous at this point. Sir Walter Scott's book, by the way, was published in 1817. But for our story today, who the author of the 1723 novel is really irrelevant. It was published while the real Robert McGregor was in prison. And because of the book, almost immediately, Robert saw his legend begin to grow. We don't really know for sure, but some historians believe the popularity of the 1723 novel about Rob Roy's life made its way to the royal court. Perhaps it was this popular opinion that led to swaying King George I in Rob's favor. Again, we don't know, but what we do know is that in 1727, King George I issued a pardon for Rob Roy. After 5 years in prison, Rob was released. For the rest of his life, Rob lived in peace with Mary and their children until, on December 28, 1734, Robert Roy McGregor passed away in his bed at home at the age of 63. All right. So that is the end, and then this will be the ending, the outro part. I'm going to make this break a little bit bigger, so I know it's the ending, since I have little breaks here with Moxie's parts. All right, so here we go. This episode of Based on a True Story was written and produced by me, Dan Lefebvre, along with my good friend over at the Your Brain on Facts podcast, Moxie LaBouche. If you want to learn more about the real Rob Roy, I would recommend the first book you read is The Hunt for Rob Roy, The Man and the Myths by David Stevenson. It's a great book that dives into the true story behind many of the legends, myths, and mysteries that have surrounded Robert McGregor. Then, if you want to learn more about those myths, you can read the 1817 novel by Sir Walter Scott. It's a classic book that I'm sure you'd enjoy, but it's not really entirely accurate. It's a novel, of course, but and again, even though it's interesting, even though it's called Rob Roy, Robert McGregor barely even makes an appearance in the book. But you could also read, another one for you, is the 1723 novel that we talked about. It's by an author that might have been Daniel Defoe or might not have been. Neither of those, the 1723 or 1817, are really historically accurate, not intended to be. They're novels. Okay, I rambled there. I don't like that. I'm going to start over. I'm going to do that whole part over again. So let's do that again. This episode of Based on a True Story was written and produced by me, Dan Lefebvre, along with my good friend over at Your Brain on Facts, Moxie LaBouche. If you want to learn more about the real Rob Roy, I would recommend the first book you read is The Hunt for Rob Roy, The Man and the Myths by David Stevenson. That's a great book that dives into the true story behind the many legends, myths, and mysteries that have surrounded Robert McGregor. And then if you want to learn more about those myths, that's when you can read the 1817 novel by Sir Walter Scott. It's a classic book I'm sure you'd enjoy. Interestingly, though, despite having his name as the title, Robert McGregor barely makes an appearance in the book. Or there's always the 1723 novel that we talked about that has an author that might have been Daniel Defoe or might not have been, but neither of those are really historically accurate. The 1723 or 1817 novels, they're not intended to be. They're novels. Okay, now Moxie's actually going to finish us out with the two truths and a lie. The answer to that there. And then here we go. So let's end this up. Finally, before we wrap up this episode, I'd like to once again say thank you to Moxie from Your Brain on Facts for joining me today and helping me out with this episode. And now that you're done here, be sure to go check out her show at yourbrainonfacts.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon. All right, that's it. We're done. Okay, we're done with recording. Now is the editing part, which we're not going to do in this video. We'll do that. I'll do that at a later point. Yeah, I think we have everything. And so this is what? I mean, I have these breaks in here, half an hour, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes worth of content, roughly. Take out some of those breaks. Maybe 15, 20 minutes, somewhere around there. And then add Moxie's in, probably another 10 or 15. So it might end up being about a half an hour episode. All right, so that's that. Thanks for watching this recording session, and until next time, have a great week.